For ad-free listening, our newsletter, special deep dive episodes, and members-only benefits, you can subscribe to us at that'sjustwild.com. Hello and welcome to That's Just Wild with me, Steve Backshall.
And me, Lizzie Daly.
And me, Sarah Roberts.
The podcast all about nature, wildlife, and how I once had a prehistoric lizard stick its tongue in my eye.
What were you doing for that?
What species? What are we talking? Big lizards or small?
It was Asian water monitor lizard in the Philippines at a campsite, and I was lying on the ground, and it was scampering around in front of me, and then it just looked up and went straight in my eye.
Oh my God!
Yeah, and today we're talking about those animals that have made it back from the brink. Where I am sitting right now, I can look out of my window and I can see two of those animals circling around me in the big blue in the form of red kites. So I live in the Chilterns, and I would suggest that the red kite reintroduction here is one of the most successful that's ever happened anywhere in the world. You know, from the 1800s until the 1980s, red kites have been completely extinct in England. There were a few left in Wales, but not that many. And then the RSPB and Natural England came together, and it, from 1989 onwards, released some right here in the Chilterns where I am right now. And today, they are our most conspicuous bird, our most visible bird. And they're clearly doing brilliantly. They are moving out across the entire country. They are naturally dispersing, and kind of proof that this kind of thing, if done right, absolutely can work.
Steve, I'm not a big birder.
Yes.
But how would I recognise a red kite if I happened to be looking in the air?
Super question. So a red kite, the reason they're conspicuous is that they're often airborne. They have a forked tail. They rarely beat their wings. They quite often soar, they bank, they weave. They're superb aerial avian aeronauts. And they're constantly gazing down to the ground for their natural prey, which is carrion, worms, beetles, small mammals. But they'll also follow farm machinery, and quite often here in this part of the world, you know, people chuck their chicken carcass out after their roast dinner, and the red kites will come down and swoop down and grab it. They have a really, really characteristic whistling call, and I say they're our most conspicuous. That doesn't mean they're our most common. So there's lots of birds around here, of which there are many more, but they're not as visible as red kites. Now I think we're up to about 4,600 breeding pairs here in the UK. You would think it would be far, far more than that. Sparrowhawks and kestrels are much more numerous, but the red kite, you just see them. They just appear to be everywhere.
Yeah, we kind of take them for granted, or at least I do, because often in Wales, especially if you're driving up from south to north, right through the centre, through the Brecon Beacons, you get so many of them. You can just kind of watch the road at the same time, but get distracted by the huge number of red kites over Gigwin Farm, who again made huge efforts to kind of bring them back. They're just an extraordinary bird.
I should say, Lizzie, that if you crash your car, I was bird watching is not going to cut it with the police. Just to remember that.
There's the red kites.
I saw a rare raptor. That is not going to get you off that charge. They're fascinating birds, and because they've made such an incredible comeback here, we're starting to see behaviours from them that we might not have done in the past. One of my finest wildlife moments here in this part of the world was seeing tumbling from red kites. Now, this is something that's not supposed to really happen from red kites. It's well known from things like bald eagles in the States. And it's where you've got a pair of birds that are probably a male and a female, and they're interacting, and they are swooping around each other mid-air. They catch a hold of each other's talons, and then they tumble. They just drop from the sky, down, 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 entangled together, spiraling and swirling in the air until they are mere meters from the ground, and they disengage and they fly off and go their separate ways, or possibly go on to continue mating. I've seen that once here in the Chilterns, and it was utterly breathtaking. You hold your breath quite literally, because it's like they are going to thunder into the ground. This pair of big old birds, they are completely entangled in each other, and in the last second they swoop away. It's really quite something to see.
Amazing.
I have seen them. I haven't seen this in many records, but I live alongside the Thames. I have seen a red kite catch a fish from the water like an osprey does.
Wow.
Which I've not seen that recorded anywhere, but they do it. They catch mayflies on the wing like a hobby would. And I've seen a lot of incredible instances of red kites doing things like snatching moorhen chicks from the surface of the water,
Oh,
being
that's
mobbed
cool.
by hundreds of jackdaws, rooks, crows, because they have raided a corvid nest and the crows are coming in and hammering them on the wing. They've become one of our finest and most treasured wildlife sightings, and they wouldn't be here without human intervention.
I love all that. They are fabulous. I actually heard of so this is out of the Gigrin farm population in Wales. Apparently, there's a group, like a bachelor group of young male red kites that would go and make every year the journey down to Cornwall. Around a similar time of year, they'd all kind of fly together down to Cornwall for a few days and then come back, like a weekend with the lads. And they don't really know why or what's driving
Wow.
them to do that, or whether one did it and then, they're teaching the others. But yeah, they're fabulous, not to be taken for granted. Speaking of funky stories of Back from the Brink, in terms of birds, we're going over to New Zealand because we can't not mention the wonderful kakapo. They're so funky looking. They're kind of these greenish, large, flightless, kind of clumsy nocturnal parrots that live in New Zealand.
Oh, I do know what this is.
So they're these quirky little birds, and unfortunately, they faced a number of threats, including the introduction of predators. They're obviously ground dwelling, being a flightless parrot. So predators are a large risk to them, as well as habitat loss. And as a result, numbers were down to about 50 of these kakapos left. And so scientists were trying to do everything they can, and they have done incredible work to bring back numbers of this kakapo. And we talked about kind of dwindling numbers, but the numbers now are around 250 plus of these kakapos. So they are doing extraordinarily well at kind of boosting those numbers, but it takes time. And a large part of that is in how they reproduce. So the females will only reproduce every 2 to 3 years, timing it with the fruiting of trees. And there's a little bit of a genetic bottleneck going on here as well. So they have to be quite particular in how the scientists are going about and actually assisting with some of the reproduction. And this is where it gets really, really cool, because not only have they boosted numbers, but they've done it using like really weird techniques, such as drone carrying sperm across New Zealand.
Oh my gosh.
So they'll collect the sperm from a male on one side of the island, and then they'll literally be like coordinating this whole thing, collect the sperm, making sure it's as viable as possible. They'll fly it to another kakapo across the other side of the island and artificially inseminate that female.
That is definitely someone who is doing their PhD and got given a much bigger grant than they expected.
I love it.
What are you going to do with all the money?
I'm a sperm pilot.
Fly sperm in drones across the country? Done, sold. There's your grant.
Yeah. They are just like a wonderful bird. And obviously these efforts are going a long way in terms of bringing back their numbers. But, I think it's one of those really positive examples of how they're using tech and really interesting ways to help bring them back. That everything about the kakapo is being monitored as well. So the weird lekking that they have, these males will compete fiercely over females. So that's all monitored with camera traps and through observations and through these GPS tags. And they wear these little backpacks, these GPS tags attached to their backs as they're kind of waddling around. So they're constantly being monitored and observed, and just an awesome, awesome story.
See, it's automatically gone on the list of creatures I'd love to meet on this planet as one of these walking parrots, but with the backpack, obviously.
Steve must have seen a kakapo in his career.
No,
must have.
No.
What?
No, I haven't. We've done a bit of filming in New Zealand. We filmed Kia, which is the terrorist parrot that lives in New Zealand. But it's quite a lot of work to film kakapo. You'd want to be absolutely targeted on finding them and filming them.
Yeah.
So no, I haven't. I did my first conservation series, like a full-on series for National Geographic, starting in the year 1999. We did it for 5 years, and we did hundreds of conservation stories all around the world. And we were always tasked with trying to find something that had a happy ending, or that had a hero who was involved, who was doing something amazing and big for conservation. And so right from the start, I was very much kind of minded that, the stories we tell are really important, and the fact that we let people know that it is possible to make a difference, that, if you get stuck into conservation, you could be the person that is, pulling a hook out of a turtle's mouth. You could be the person that is, instrumental in the Andean condor getting to fly free again. Because those are the things that motivate people. And I think that while we can secretly sometimes be crushed, we have to be really careful to make sure that, we share the good news stories, because those are the things that get people interested and involved. Or do you disagree? I know, Sarah, sometimes you don't agree with that.
No, Steve, I have gone out of my way to dig around to make sure that I bring you only positives this time. So I am refraining from any negative.
Oh, am I going to be the gloomy one?
Yes. Someone's got to bring the balance, Lizzie.
It's why we have a job. I mean, it's why we do what we do, is what drives us, is what gets us up in the morning, to be honest. And I will be real about it, because across all taxa, across all environments, across the whole planet, I would go as far to say there's not one species that hasn't been touched by some kind of threat or issue. I'll give you a great example. If you were out to go on the shore here in Wales in the winter months and see Eurasian curlew, you would think that they're absolutely fine, numbers are thriving. Now, in the UK, we have about 25% of breeding population of Eurasian curlew. But actually, in terms of how many are breeding, they're facing huge declines and huge threats. So I'd always encourage those who are thinking about, how to conserve, how we have done in the past, and how we can positively move forward, to think critically about that.
One of the really, really difficult subjects. I've been filming the rhino conservation story for about 25 years. And when I first started, it was kind of like, oh, these amazing prehistoric looking animals have been around forever. And, people are starting to use their horn as an aphrodisiac. And then progressively through the years, it got worse and worse and worse. And every time I go back to certain places, particularly Southern Africa, the story gets more and more intense, and it seems like it is getting more and more critical. One of the places that I've been to that has had a good news story is Kaziranga National Park in Assam, the last great bastion for the one-horned rhino, which is a stonking looking animal. We're quite familiar with the white rhino and the black rhino, both from Africa. But this has kind of what appear to be armored plates all over its body. To find one in amongst this extraordinary landscape in Assam really feels like you've been transported back in time. They're extraordinarily prehistoric looking. The first time I filmed them, don't hate on me because this was a long time ago, but we did it on elephant back in Kaziranga, which obviously I wouldn't do now, but at the time
was it cool though? Before
it
we
was
judged,
very
though,
cool.
was
It was
really
very cool. And at the time, it was sold as being a conservation success story because the elephants that we were riding on had been, used by mahouts in industry in India and were now shipped out there for a retirement, kind of taking tourists around to see rhinos. So it was then sold as being a conservation success story. Obviously, you shouldn't ride on an elephant. I wouldn't do it again. But we went out and we filmed these phenomenal animals in Kaziranga. And Kaziranga now has about 2/3 of the global population of one-horned rhino. In the 1970s, there were only a couple of hundred left, and it looked like they would completely disappear. Now there are as many as 4,000. And it's mostly down to the efforts of the National Parks Authority in Kaziranga. And they've done all sorts of amazing things to protect the habitat, to cherish each individual rhino, some of which are very controversial. Now, I know that, Sarah, you are always really, really keen to make sure that people have stewardship of their wildlife and people are
100%.
always involved in the animals that live in their land. In Kaziranga, couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, over some years of this big policy to protect one-horned rhino, they have had a shoot to kill policy. So if there are people inside Kaziranga who appear to be there to poach rhino, then they get shot, which is, really, really intense and something which asks a lot of questions.
We have that in a lot of areas in Africa, actually, I believe, the shoot to kill policy I think that also comes for protection for the anti-poaching squad too, because a lot of the poachers are heavily armed.
Yeah.
I just want to say that rhino are one of the few creatures that we have a real opportunity, and this is controversial, but I think we just have such an easy opportunity to save them. And it blows my mind that we have not legalized the trade in rhino horns, because that's one very, very, very easy way to solve the problem, because unlike elephants, the rhino horn grows back like a fingernail. It's harvested on a huge level right now to protect the rhinos. In a very simplistic terms, we are taking the horns off rhino to protect the rhino. Those are being stockpiled and kept safe. If we were to put them onto the market, we could flood that market. We could bring down the price of a rhino horn so that it would not be worthwhile for people, because it's not the poachers that earn loads of money, it's those agents in between. But it would not be worth their while to come in and poach the rhinos. And I think it's an option that really needs much more conversation around it, because there's huge farms already set up for rhino where these reserves all around Africa can't afford to keep them because it costs so much to protect them having boots on the ground. They instead give those rhino over to larger farmed areas, which I've visited in the past, because, I can't stop from keeping my nose right in the middle of all these controversial topics. But I have a lot of hope for rhino.
Can I chip
really
in on that?
do. Yeah, please.
So a lot of the work I've done in Africa around rhino has kind of revolved around that very question and that very topic. There are private reserves in southern Africa where you can go, and each individual rhino has an armed guard, and there will be, at the cost of many million of rand, people who are usually ex-special forces trained, who will follow around individual rhino to make sure they don't get poached, and they still get killed and they still get shot. And that whole idea of, like you say, farming rhino for their horns, taking the horn and then flooding the market using existing stocks, has been a hot topic for a long time. But one thing that's argued is that you're looking at places like, actually, Vietnam is probably the biggest growth market for rhino horn. China is I think subtly on the decline, but you're looking at potentially 1.5 billion customers. And there is a real risk that at present, rhino horn is a status symbol, is something that's very expensive. It's quite often used, this blows my mind, but it is in some cases not used because of its believed medicinal values, but can be literally sprinkled into cocktails because it's so expensive and because it is a gratuitous display of wealth. And one of the problems is that if you do radically reduce the price of rhino horn, that doesn't mean that demand is going to go down. In actual fact, what's going to happen is that the middle class is then going to see rhino horn as something that they can use. And the lower middle class and people that don't have a huge amount of money, all of a sudden rhino horn will be available to them, and it could increase the demand. And one of the things that is actually a lot of scientific groups around the world are working on is actually instead coming up with an artificial alternative. So coming up with rhino horn that can be grown in a lab, or rhino horn that can be synthesized.
Super interesting.
And that potentially could move things on. All of a sudden, if it's not seen as coming from a finite stock, you could lose that cachet.
Yeah. The thing is, though, it would not be a finite stock, because rhino horn only takes 2 to 3 years to grow back. And fully grow back. They have to cut them every 2 to 3 years, all of these places that have rhino. And we have a large amount, especially in the farms, and breeding camps. They don't call them farms. I refer to them mostly as that. But what is interesting, though, is the economy that could bring for other conservation issues, for them to put into fencing, to put into anti-poaching. That would bring money into those areas.
At the same
too.
time,
I
surely
know
that
difficult.
leads to scenarios like tiger zoos where tigers
Exactly.
are being
Yeah.
bred for their skins
Gets
and their bones.
complicated.
I mean, it's a horrible perception of what a wild animal is and is for. And at the same time, this is supposed to be the happy episode.
I just want to jump in and like, to Steve's point, I think he's absolutely bang on in terms of the unknowns. And I know we talked about it in a different episode, but with the shark fin trade, it's exactly what happened. It was a delicacy for the elite. And then in the 70s and 80s, you had this new wealth that came through China. And suddenly those in the middle class that never had those opportunities craved that delicacy and bought it. And it absolutely drove it through the roof. So I think as a model, it's a risk. But I guess from my side, they're a charismatic animal. They have everything they could possibly need to be like the emblems of, how we conserve and how we do it properly, and how we, success stories like in the park that you were working in, Steve. But, time and time again, I get, look at this, Debbie Downer's coming in. But, Sudan's a great example, just because I happened by absolute chance to be in Albajeta the week before Sudan died.
Sorry, who's Sudan for?
Yeah, so Sudan...
Is that an actual rhino? I thought you were on about the place then for a second.
No. No, so it's the last male northern white rhino. So he, along with two females, were left in 2018, and then Sudan then died. So they're functionally extinct. The two females are infertile, and since then they've done a lot of work trying to use new technology. Uh, artificial insemination of the females, and trying to use southern white rhinos to basically bring back this species from extinction. So I do want to talk a little bit about de-extinction later on. But for now, Sarah, what's this about a poo zoo?
Yeah, go on. Let me lighten the mood.
Lighten the
here.
mood!
Okay. Well, so the Poo Zoo was created by the University of Oxford, Chester Zoo, and Revive and Restore, and it's essentially looking at the fact that over 1 million species are threatened by extinction right now and in the coming decade. They are biobanking. So they're able to collect the poo from lots of different animals. And in that, they can take intestinal cells that are on those feces, and they're able to sort of harvest stem cells, which we know a stem cell is a cell that doesn't have any kind of function yet, and technically can be used to clone any of these animal species if the worst came to the worst. So in theory, you could technically bring animals together that are geographically far away from each other and create new offspring without them ever having to meet in person. So it's sort of like a insurance policy that I think there's a few different insurance policies out there that are looking at stem cells, but I particularly like this because it's called a poo zoo. Yeah.
Love a poo zoo.
Well, sometimes recovery efforts take a long time, but sometimes animals bounce back quite quickly. Well, I want to bring in an interesting looking antelope, a Saiga antelope.
Cool
Yes.
looking animals.
Bizarre, utterly weird looking animals.
Weird, aren't they?
Basically looks like an antelope that came out of Star Wars. So it's got this crazy long nose, and it's really floppy on the front of its head.
Yeah, like the cantina scene
Yeah.
in the first Star Wars movie.
I would never encourage touching animals, but weirdly, with the Saiga antelope, I just want to touch the face. I don't know why.
It's the flop.
that weird?
Well, yeah, it is because
Is
it's
that
kind
weird?
of got like
It just looks
It- it-
really
it doesn't-
soft and forget it. Let's move
Oh,
on.
you're digging that hole. Okay.
Christ.
So, in 2003, 6% of Saiga populations remained in Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Russia, and Uzbekistan. And they lost 90% of their population in just a few years. So, they were graded critically endangered. That was for many reasons. It was hunting, it was poaching, habitat loss. There was a big fence that was erected between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, so there's no migratory route. So these guys were like dropping and dwindling in numbers. But then in 2015, half of the global population was lost almost overnight due to a mysterious blood disease that was transmitted through their noses. So that was really, really bad news for our Saiga, and people didn't have high hopes at all of their recovery. But then this is really nice because it was countries working together, which doesn't always happen very often or very quickly. But all of these neighboring countries got together and they protected them. They changed the quota for hunting where there were higher populations in Kazakhstan. They made anti-poaching measures increased in other places. And they made this huge area for the Saiga antelope to eat and to move through because they're actually critical to plant dispersal as well, these antelope. And essentially, as the economies got more secure around these species, they're now classed as near threatened by the ICUN because those populations have actually managed to recover really, really well in that short period of time. I mean, we still, I think, don't know too much about that blood transmissive disease. So that's always going to be a worry. But I guess the ones that are surviving, are they the ones, would you say, that are immune or have some immunity to that? You'd hope maybe they can pass some sort of resistance on to future populations. But either way, really nice, positive story.
It's a great example of actually, how human intervention can be used really well. One that absolutely we must talk about is the South Georgia rat eradication project. It was, I think, it's arguably one of the most successful stories simply because the scale of it, It went over a number of years. It started in 2011 and actually finished in 2018. And I'll kind of go back to the beginning. The whaling industry and the sealing vessels that were coming to the subantarctic island of South Georgia, this incredible place, they had the arrival in the 19th and 20th century of this industry. And unfortunately, with that industry, they brought in rats and different populations of rats across the island. And so these rats were slowly starting to eradicate, in fact, to the point of species being critically endangered. They're wiping out or the penguin colonies, the chicks, the albatross, the South Georgia pipit, the petrels, all the ground nesting and burrowing species that were found on South Georgia were being pushed to their limits. And so this big kind of project came together, again, international cooperation, where they were going to release poison bait around the island as part of this eradication effort. And it was massively successful.
Unless you're a rat.
Unless you're a rat, for sure. It costs, I don't even know how much money, billions and billions to actually successfully do this, but they did so. And over those 7 years, they completely eradicated all the rats on the island. And now, if you go to South Georgia, it's ridiculous. There's birds literally everywhere you look. The pipits, the petrels, the penguin colonies. It's just like they're tumbling out of the island that is South Georgia. So for me, it's like one of the best success stories, I would say.
Steve's smiling, so that means that Steve approved it.
That works on the hope-o-meter. I'm absolutely going for that. You're allowed that story.
10 out of 10.
Nothing died apart from Pinky in the Brain and a few other rats.
I know, I'm the only one sad for them. I'll mourn their losses, but obviously, yeah, good for the birds.
Can I share the story of one of my most precious conservation success stories?
Please, Steve.
The very first conservation success story that I filmed was in Monterey Bay in California, and it was with sea otters. And it was the cutest thing you've ever seen. These tiny little sea otter pups, which are the cutest animals on the planet, who were being cared for by keepers who were using little sea otter puppets that they were using to feed the sea otters, which was absurdly cute, so that they wouldn't get too kind of connected to their human keepers, before taking them out for a swim and teaching them how to dive down and catch crabs and smash them open on their chests. It was just amazing.
Did you get to do that?
Unfortunately, we weren't allowed. It was, permits and risk assessments, all that kind of nonsense. But then we went back for a live television series called Big Blue Live, filmed out of Monterey Bay. And we got to see quite how well Monterey Bay has recovered, and got more of a sense of the overall picture of the recovery of Monterey Bay, because it had been a completely dead place. It had the biggest fishery in the world was in Monterey Bay. They stripped out everything. The kelp disappeared. The sea otters were hunted for fur. The seals and sea lions for meat. The whales completely disappeared, all hunted out using through whaling. And then one of the first critical figures in the conservation of Monterey Bay was Julia Platt, who was the first mayor of the area. And in the late 1800s, she was an epidemiologist. She'd studied at Woods Hole. She was fascinated by marine biology, and she started setting up marine protected areas. And this whole process, I mean, this is in like the late 1800s and the early 1900s, where for a woman to be doing something like that was a big deal, a massive deal. And she's still very much commemorated in the area as being kind of the architect of the conservation of Monterey Bay. And then in the late 90s, there were huge no-take zones set up, and it was declared as a national marine sanctuary. And very kind of gently, quietly, out of nowhere, the sea otters just started to come back. They naturally dispersed and naturally rocked up in Monterey. And as they rocked up, they started taking the abalone that had been eating the stipe of the kelp, and the kelp came back. And within the kelp came all the fish, and the seals came back, and then the whales came back. And when we did Big Blue Live, this was a really important thing for my career, because I think it was the first time that I'd ever gone viral. Because we were broadcasting live. I was on the deck of a boat talking to a local marine biologist. There were humpback whales all around us. And the first time a blue whale has ever been filmed live happened then and there while I was on that boat. And I lost my mind.
The clip is insane, Sarah.
This clip that went out about me kind of going, hey, I never thought I'd be able to see this, and this would never have been possible 20 years ago when their numbers had disappeared and 99% of them are gone, and now they're back here, and just, completely going bananas. And so the recovery of Monterey Bay is very precious to me. It's been something that's been through my career, but something that goes over several hundred years and has seen an entire ecosystem recover, and everything that's there now leads to this burgeoning, beautiful, legendary place that draws in people from all over the world to see a marine environment at its very, very best. And that all started with one person on a mission.
I love that. That's a lovely
Awesome.
story.
And actually, just on that, the bounce back of species like the humpback whale and blue whale are phenomenal globally. You know, I mentioned South Georgia, and we've seen the bounce back after whaling was banned, and it has been phenomenal with humpback whales. They are not only bouncing back, but they're doing extraordinarily well. Similarly with blue whales in the Southern Ocean and those populations, but I never thought in my career I'd ever be able to actually see a blue whale. And now you can go to, Baja, Mexico at the right time of year and get to see just the towering blow in the distance. And I think that in itself is just extraordinary to see how this just incredible animal that's beyond our imagination is just casually seen off our coast,
Yeah.
which is beautiful.
Very true.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of something that bounces back and has bounced back very, very quickly, the alligator. When colonizers went to America and they saw these big teethy looking dinosaurs in their back garden for the first time, obviously they panicked and they shot lots of them. And because there wasn't much food available, they thought, well, you know what, if we've killed it, we may as well eat it. And then they were like, oh, actually, this is really quite tasty. Have either of you ever eaten alligator?
No.
As if I would admit it if I had.
I just asked a vegetarian that as well. Yeah, well, I have. I'll admit it. It tastes kind of like chicken mixed with prawns, and it is very readily available in the States, particularly in Florida. It is one of their staple foods, and in that time, when colonizers first got over there, it was really, really valuable to them. And because you didn't want to waste anything, they also then took the skin and they realized it could make really good leather products. So alligators were killed not just because we were scared of them, but also because they had a big value monetarily. And so many of these alligators were then shot in great numbers that by the mid 1900s, we had almost run out of American alligators. They'd almost gone extinct. And the Floridian government were like, okay, well, actually, they're quite valuable for our economy and we think they're quite tasty. Better do something about it. They said, right, you can't go out and hunt these alligators anymore. We'll give out a few permits to some of you, but for the rest of you, you can't do it. There's not many left. What we're going to do instead is if you've got a big pond, you can put a great big fence around the edge of it and you can take some from the wild and you can farm them. And so that was the start of alligator farming. Now, alligator farming is still today very, very strong in that area of the world. It's the weirdest thing. But in making alligator farms and taking that hunting pressure off their wild counterparts, American alligator populations recovered. Dramatically recovered. And what happened at exactly the same time, because I love a bit of irony here, is more and more people moved to Florida. And as they moved to Florida, they didn't want to live in the swamps. So we drained the Everglades and that national park has got smaller and smaller. And those areas of swampland, the natural territory for American alligators, decreased. But we built these big canal systems. Now, in those canal systems, you always have fish. The size of an American alligator is completely governed by the amount of food available for it. Now, in the canal systems, you've got all these American alligators that are thriving, that are bigger than any other alligator than ever before, and are now coming closer to people than ever before. And so those gators went from near critically endangered to suddenly we got loads of them. It's a really weird and interesting situation. What do you guys think?
Crocodilians are very ripe for positive reintroduction efforts. I worked around the world with Orinoco crocs, muggers, saltwater crocodiles, Tomistoma, gharial, Chinese alligators. The reason that they are so prime, as are turtles, is because you have a nest with 40, 60 eggs within it, and the chances of one of those reaching adulthood is very slim. The mortality rate is sky high, and it's particularly while the eggs are in the nest and in the first year of life. So what Lobs worked out really quickly was if you could protect a nest and you could take the eggs and then hatch them out into hatchlings, take care of those for 1 year until the animal is self-sufficient and then release them, then you can radically increase their chances of surviving to adulthood. And there are so many projects around the world that have recreated what you're talking about there as success for a particular species of crocodilian or of turtles by doing just that, by getting rid of that massive mortality rate when they're very young. And easily the craziest thing I've done in my entire life was working in the Northern Territories of Australia on one of those projects. And we were picked up very first thing in the morning by my pal with his helicopter, and he had a line dangled down underneath the helicopter, which we clipped onto our harness, and then we were flown up in the air, pulled up on this line, hanging underneath the helicopter to be dropped onto the top of a saltwater crocodile nest, where we would go in and we would take the eggs, particularly in an area where they were about to be flooded, so you're going to lose the entire nest. We'd take the eggs, you'd then raise them up, and you had a viable population. But I lowered down under a helicopter on a line onto a nest with a female croc sat on top of it guarding it. And that there is probably the biggest flex of my life.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie.
Super James Bond.
When you go on the Darwin River though, and they have that big piece of meat dangling from the line that you hang over the side of the boat, and, yeah, literally watch those saltwater crocodiles leap up and jump.
The Australians do it differently, don't they? They've just done their own lane.
Yes, they do.
Sarah, I've seen that bounce back that you're talking about, you know, after spending a bit of time in the Everglades, absolutely everywhere. My favourite experience was in the Atchafalaya Basin off of the saltwater from Gulf of Mexico mixes with the Atchafalaya River. And there's these incredible bold cypress trees that huge kind of sentinels, and they stand there with draped in Spanish moss. And we went there really early morning, and you could just see the number of gators just hanging out in the water there. It was just absolutely extraordinary. Also in the Everglades, I had this really kind of quick shoot where we were just going out to monitor and collect data for one of the local scientists, and that's where I stuck my finger up an alligator for the first time to
Which
sex
mean you
them.
stuck your finger up an alligator?
Where the sun don't shine.
Okay. You molested a gator.
Honestly, I molested a gator, and I wasn't part of the shoot. He was just like, get your finger in there. I don't know why he's Australian. He wasn't. But it's where I go. Anyway, it's my first ever experience. Very personal, probably too much for this podcast. Cancelling myself.
Very personal for the alligator.
At the top of this recording, we didn't want to make things too negative, but the de-extinction efforts, I was just going to basically talk about negatives.
Do it.
You know, around the world, we're seeing some extraordinary scientific efforts, conservation efforts to bring back species from the edge. In the news more recently, efforts around de-extinction, so literally finding ways through genetic manipulation. And it's one that I think has big ethical and scientific considerations. And there's parts of me which feels that we're focusing too much on what we can do to fix things in the way that we think they should be fixed, versus actually focusing on what we need to do to save species and use kind of nature-based solutions and use the adaptations and all the sophisticated ways that the planet helps itself first and foremost. I'd love to know what you think.
I think you're being very, very careful and very diplomatic about how you say all of that, Lizzie.
I am.
I will be more forthright.
Please.
I think it's bollocks.
Yes.
I was listening to a podcast last night with one of the guys who is part of the effort to de-extinct the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger. And he was so excited about, you know, all of the science that they're using to taking DNA, reconstructing the genome of the Tassie tiger. Amazing, fantastic. Looking at putting some of that DNA into a dunnet, which is a small marsupial, to within 10 years have brought back the thylacine. And just this unbelievable excitement at the cleverness that it had taken to achieve that. I heard exactly the same thing with the scientists who have brought back, in inverted commas, the dire wolf. And it rings of that Jeff Goldblum quote in the first Jurassic Park, that you spent so much time thinking about whether you could that you never addressed whether you should. And that is, to me, at the heart of all of this. I worked with the scientists who mapped the woolly mammoth genome. And you talk to them about things, efforts to bring back the woolly mammoth, you will never see such derision and contempt. If you are going to put mammoth DNA into an Asian elephant, you have not brought back the woolly mammoth. You have created a twisted, messed up, slightly more hairy Asian elephant. Our papers are full of great headlines that we are de-extincting these animals, that we are bringing them back. We are not. What we're doing is putting hundreds and hundreds of millions into these phony efforts that require, yes, a lot of intellect, a lot of effort, incredible discoveries, but unless those are being used for real benefit, why? What is the purpose? What would be the reason to bring back an animal to an environment that doesn't exist anymore, with no other possible pals to hang out with or mate and reproduce with, is purely for our own benefit, our own glory? It achieves nothing. And we've talked here about the real efforts, conservationists out in the field fighting, battling, screaming out for every single penny to try and save the animals we do have. So why are we pouring hundreds of millions into these just hideous Island of Dr. Moreau kind of projects that achieve nothing but get big headlines? It makes me feel sick to my stomach.
100%. Well said.
Is it the terminology that bothers you most, Steve? Like the de-extinction? Because actually, it sounds more like what they're doing is creating new.
But why is the question?
Yeah. Why? I mean,
Because they can, Lizzie.
listen, there is no doubt that an awful lot of the big discoveries of the past have been things that, yes, have been done have been done without the end goal necessarily in mind. There have been discoveries in pharmacology that have led to other outcomes that we could never have predicted and that further the cause of science, and that's great. But, if people around the world have the idea that it doesn't matter if we lose something because we can just bring it back. No, we can't. And that's just the totally wrong way of addressing our problems. I'm sorry, I've got properly on my soapbox about this.
It's absolutely brilliant. And that's exactly, you said it much more concisely than I did. But I was trying to put a word to, I guess, how I feel about it when I read about these stories of direwolf and the mammoth ants and all the rest of it. And I think it is actually slightly insulting. It's this whole clever cheekiness of like, oh, we've just managed to shape evolution and create new technology to save the planet, when we're absolutely rubbish at saving the species that we already have, and the efforts that are being put into and the years of work and understanding of long-term data that it takes to understand whether we will be able to save a species. It's thorough, it's rigorous, it's done by teams across the world and requires plenty of funding that you talked about, Steve. And I'm in awe every time I see this wave of people who are just becoming obsessed with these de-extinction efforts. I couldn't agree more.
I can totally see where you guys are coming from. I guess from my side of it, if you take away the titling and the branding and the idea behind it, I guess there's like a little curious kid part of me that's like, what kind of weird animals can you make? But I don't know, ethically or morally, is it right? I don't know.
Yeah.
But should we have something positive to finish on?
Yes. So this is a real world positive one. My first big expedition back in the early 1990s was to then Irian Jaya, the western half of Papua New Guinea. And I tried to make the first descent of the Balim River, the Barlim River, which it comes from the highlands all the way down to the south coast. This massive, like 600-kilometer river, failed dismally. And as I got down into the southern wetlands, the Asmat region, even back in the sort of mid to early 1990s, I could see the effects of deforestation. I could see them taking out all of the big timber and big areas of the rainforest that were just gone. And then in about 2017, 2018, I went back for a BBC project with Aldo to try and make the first descent of the river from source to sea. It was an epic expedition, full on thundering white water, peoples in the middle of the jungle just appearing with bows and arrows drawn, pointed at our throats, astounding animals, cassowaries, birds of paradise. And when we got to the Asmat lands, and I've been fully intending to be, doing all kinds of pieces to camera about deforestation, about the fact that the forests had gone and, what a tragedy it was, they were perfect. they were completely burgeoning with life. There was not a single human being, and the forest had bounced back. The super important, mahoganies and ironwoods had been taken, but the secondary forest that remained had grown back in such intense vigor that they were packed with life. And it was
Awesome.
so unexpected. And to see this immense forest, and I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, that had all of a sudden come back to life in style, was one of the most heartening things I've seen in my career. And it's another one of those moments where you just want to say, look at this, nature,
Yeah.
give it a chance. It will and can bounce back.
What a beautiful visual to end on.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. So remember, you'll have a Q&A episode coming your way on Friday. Please send your questions, as always, to questions@thatsjustwild.com, and we will get to them.
Yes, now we are just a little honeybee larvae of a show, so any support is really welcome. You can follow us on your favourite podcast app, leave a review, it makes all the difference to us and the whole team. Don't forget to send us your questions as well, lots and lots of questions, because we love them. And for ad-free listening, our newsletter, special deep dive episodes and members only benefits, you can subscribe to us at thatsjustwild.com. Remember, we're on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and you can find us at That's Just Wild Pod.
Thanks for listening. See you next week.